And so there's been some talk lately about sort of a crisis in Social Security. So can you explain what people mean when they say that?
It's complicated and yet it's simple. So let me start with the simple part. Basically, Social Security has always been what's called a pay-as-you-go. Well, until the 80s was completely a pay-as-you-go program. What that means is that it was really just transferring income and spending power from people who were working to people who were retired or disabled. And what that meant is that it's a social insurance program that the people who were working made a sort of pact with people who were elderly that they would take care of them in their old age. And that pact is really beneficial in a lot of ways to young people, because the alternative is you have to take care of your parents yourself rather than have it spread over the whole nation to take care of your parents when they retire. And so the crisis, in a very simple way, comes about because, as many people know, during the 40s and 50s, up until about 1960, after the war, people had these really big families, and it was typical for people to have 4 or 5 or even more children. And that was called a baby boom. And so there was this big cohort of people, between the ages of, who are now between the ages of 55 and 70, who were born in this very short period, and they, for the most part, did not have big families. They tended to have, 1, 2, 3 children. So now all of these people are retiring or beginning to retire or will retire in the next 5 or 6 years or 10 years, and so this smaller, younger generation has to take care of this bigger, older generation. And not only are there more of them compared to the size of the workforce, the elderly people, but they're living longer. So if they retire at 65, instead of dying 3 years later, as they did in the 1930s when Social Security was first enacted, they're living to 82, and so they're collecting benefits for a longer period of time. So the simple question is, how can a relatively small workforce take care of a relatively big proportion of retirees? And by the way, this is not just a problem in the United States. It's not even as big a problem in the United States as it is in other countries, where Japan, for example, has one of the biggest cohorts of elderly people compared to their workforce of any country in the world. So all the European countries, Japan, all the developed countries are facing the same problem because they did have large families after the war, and then subsequently had smaller families.
And so are there plans right now or what's the discussion, I guess, around either raising Social Security payments or fixing sort of this imbalance?
Well, there's a slight imbalance. Right now, Social Security isn't taking in enough in payroll taxes to fully cover the benefits they pay. They presume, supposedly, they have this, what's called a trust fund. This trust fund began in 1983 under the Reagan administration. And the idea was that people who were working would start paying in more to the Social Security system than they really needed to pay out in benefits, and the difference would be saved up by Social Security. And they've saved up about $3 trillion. And now when you save money, it's not like you put it in a vault in Fort Knox and just go and pull it out as you need it. You invest it in something. And Social Security was investing these dollars by law in federal government bonds, which is the federal government's debt. And what that means is that the rest of the government now owes Social Security that $3 trillion. They also owe them interest on that $3 trillion. Until 2012, Social Security didn't actually need to draw on that money, and so they weren't actually asking the rest of the government to give them funding, but now they are. and they're going to continue to do that for the next 20 or 30 years. And so the crisis in Social Security, the immediate crisis in Social Security, is a financial crisis or a fiscal crisis, fiscal referring to government spending, in the sense that the rest of the government now has to cough up some funds for Social Security. Who pays taxes to the rest of the government? Well, that's income taxes. Income taxes are mostly paid by the wealthy. About 50-60% of people pay no or very little income tax. Income taxes rise as your income rises. The federal income tax is what's called a progressive tax. So to get money from the federal government to the Social Security Administration means taking that money from largely well-off people and giving it to largely middle class and lower middle class elderly people. Now the whole political agreement with Social Security was that the rich wouldn't pay. The rich didn't need Social Security. They can finance their own retirements, and they would object to the system if they have to pay. So now we're facing this crisis where the people with high incomes are being asked to pay into the Social Security system and support people with low incomes, and that's creating a political crisis for the system, because now the government has to start coming up with this money. That's the kind of a political and economic crisis that Social Security faces right now.
So even though the money was paid into Social Security, now the issue is that
nobody wants to pay it
nobody wants
back.
to pay it back. Okay.
Yeah, and the thing is that it was never, to pay into the Social Security system to save this money was never a very sensible idea in the first place because of this problem, because they weren't actually saving it. They were just making a future claim on the government for this revenue that was going to become a problem once this claim came due.
So when we talk about the trust fund, there were workers in the 80s and 90s who were putting in more than technically was needed. And now if those people are retiring, those are the people that are asking for benefits, or those are the ones that are potentially going to get their benefits cut or aren't getting as much as they put in. So I guess how does that work out when we're talking about the trust fund?
That's a really good question. When the Social Security taxes were raised in 1983 to begin sort of building up a surplus that was then turned over to the government to spend, the rest of the government to spend. Those, at that time, the Reagan administration was in power, and they had cut taxes on the top earners from 50% to 28%. And so the government deficit went from about $50 billion under Carter to, expanded to about $200 billion under Reagan. So the Social Security system was essentially funding that shortfall through these higher payroll taxes. So essentially, people who made less than the equivalent of $117,000 were financing this tax cut for the rich through the Social Security Trust Fund. And so in a sense, now the Social Security does that trust fund, those bonds are coming due, and so now those same people who got the tax break are saying, well, we don't want to repay this money, and so they're asking the same people who overpaid to now take a cut in benefits. So it's a very, politically a very disturbing kind of situation.
And so there's also been a lot of recent discussion about contingent workforce and sort of the rise in minimum wage jobs and things like that. And so does that sort of maybe lower incomes or less ability to plan for retirement for people who are working now, does that affect at all either the present or sort of future planning for Social Security?
Yeah, and like I say, the maldistribution of income, or the fact that so much, and from 2008 to 2011, I think is when the latest data came out, 93% of all the growth of GDP, all the gains in income that the economy experienced, which weren't great, but which were 1.5–2% a year, went to the top 1%. 93%. So the other 99% shared 7% of the gain in income. And that's creating a problem for Social Security because the payroll base on which they're taxing is not growing even when the economy grows. But it also means that people can't rely on other forms of saving or other kinds of supports for their retirement.